Picture this. It's June 8th, 793 after Christ. Dawn is breaking over the North Sea, and if you're standing on the shores of Holy Island, what we call Lindisfarne today, you can hear something that would have been as familiar to those medieval ears as the sound of car engines is to us. Monastery bells, ringing across the water, calling the faithful to morning prayers. Now, here's what makes this moment so absolutely fascinating from a historical perspective. Inside those stone walls, every monk worth his salt is dropping his tools and heading for the chapel. The guy tending the vegetable garden, he's leaving his hoe right there in the dirt. The fellow copying manuscripts, his quill is still wet with ink, but he's already halfway to the altar. And here's the kicker, every single door in that monastery is wide open, no guards posted, no weapons at the ready. Why would there be? These are holy men, living in what they consider the absolute safest place in the Christian world. But something else is cutting through that morning mist. Something that would change the course of European history. Dragon-headed ships, longships, and standing at the prow of the lead vessel is a young Norwegian warrior named Bjorn Ironside, and yes, that's the same Bjorn who would later become the stuff of legend. He's actually counting those bell tolls, because Bjorn has figured out something that no other warrior in Europe has understood yet. See, this isn't just another raid. This is the moment when Viking warfare evolves from random piracy into something approaching modern military intelligence. Bjorn has done his homework. He knows that those bells aren't just calling people to prayer, they're announcing that every single fighting-age man in the monastery will be inside that church for the next hour, hands clasped in devotion rather than wrapped around sword hilts. Think about the mathematics here for a second. 173 Norse, warriors against what? Maybe 30 monks who have taken vows of non-violence? The odds weren't just favourable, they were astronomical. But here's what makes this raid different from every other Viking attack before it. Bjorn didn't just stumble into good timing. He planned it. The attack itself unfolds exactly as predicted. The Vikings beach their ships, storm the monastery, and find exactly what Bjorn expected. Zero resistance. But what happens next is what transforms this from just another successful raid into the beginning of a revolution in medieval warfare. Because Bjorn doesn't just take the gold and silver and sail home, he takes something far more valuable: manuscripts, religious texts, and most importantly, a complete Christian calendar. Now, imagine you're Bjorn, and you're looking at this parchment covered with Latin script. You can't read a word of it, but you've got captured monks who can translate, and as they explain what you're holding, you start to realize something incredible. This isn't just a calendar, it's a roadmap. A roadmap showing every single day when Christians across Europe will be completely vulnerable. Easter Sunday? Every Christian warrior will be in church celebrating the resurrection. Christmas Day? Same story. The Feast of St. Martin? The celebration of All Saints, day after day, month after month. This captured calendar shows Bjorn exactly when his enemies will voluntarily disarm themselves in the name of their faith. But the brilliance doesn't stop there. Within months, this intelligence is spreading through Norse trading networks faster than any military communication system in medieval Europe. Picture Viking merchants stopping at trading posts from Norway to Denmark, sharing this information like it's the most valuable cargo they're carrying. Because it is. The transformation is rapid and decisive. Within 5 years, Viking warbands across Scandinavia are coordinating their attacks using captured calendar knowledge. And here's where it gets really interesting from a modern perspective. Monasteries from Ireland to Francia start reporting the same disturbing pattern in their chronicles. The heathens always attack when Christians are at prayer. Always. It's not luck anymore. It's not coincidence. It's systematic. The Vikings have weaponized the Christian faith against itself. Now, let's talk about why this happened when it did. Because the timing isn't accidental. See, Norway in the late 8th century is facing what economists today would recognize as a classic resource crisis. Too many people, not enough land. The math is brutal. Inheritance laws that give everything to the firstborn son leaving younger brothers like Bjorn with exactly nothing. No land, no wealth, no prospects. For these younger sons, the choice is simple. Stay home and remain poor, or go Viking and maybe come back rich enough to matter. But traditional raiding is dangerous, unpredictable work. You might attack a monastery and find it defended by 100 knights. You might storm a village and discover the local lord's army just happened to be visiting. Random raids meant random results. But holy day raids? That's different. That's guaranteed success. And successful raiders return with enough wealth to buy ships, recruit crews, establish themselves as jarls. The secret spreads through women's networks too, because Viking wives are learning to read Latin calendars from their captured nun slaves, creating an intelligence apparatus that spans the known world. Think about that for a moment. Viking women, supposedly barbarian savages according to Christian chroniclers, are operating one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in medieval Europe. They're tracking religious observances across dozens of kingdoms, memorizing feast days, calculating optimal attack windows. While their husbands are sharpening axes, these women are building databases. The economic impact is staggering. Successful holy day raids inject massive amounts of wealth into Scandinavian society, creating a whole new class of Viking entrepreneurs. Young men who would have remained poor farmers back home are coming back as ship owners, crew leaders, even kings. The calendar raids don't just change Viking tactics, they transform Viking society. And here's the thing that really gets me about this story. The Christians see it happening. They write about it in their chronicles. They know the pattern. But they can't stop it, because stopping it would mean abandoning their faith. It would mean posting guards during Easter service, carrying weapons during Christmas Mass, treating every holy day like a potential battlefield. Some communities try half measures, a few guards here, a lookout there. But it's not enough, and worse, it's a public admission of doubt. How do you tell your congregation that God might not protect them during their most sacred moments? How do you balance faith with survival? The Vikings, meanwhile, are developing their own counter-calendar. They start celebrating something they call the Harvest of Christ Gold, their own festivals timed to coincide with Christian holy days. It's psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. Not only are they attacking when Christians are most vulnerable, they're celebrating their own victories on the same days Christians are supposed to be celebrating God's glory. By 820, after Christ, less than 30 years after that first raid on Lindisfarne, Viking longhouses contain a sight that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Christian slaves teaching Norse children to read Latin texts while their mothers sharpen battle axes. The raiders have evolved from opportunistic pirates into what we might recognize today as a sophisticated intelligence service. The secret that Bjorn discovered on that morning in 793 doesn't stay secret for long. But it doesn't need to. Because even when everyone knows what's happening, even when every Christian kingdom understands the pattern, the fundamental vulnerability remains. Faith still demands that Christians gather for worship. Sacred time still requires laying down arms. And the Vikings have learned to turn Christianity's greatest strength, its unifying power, into its greatest weakness. The bells that called those monks to prayer on June 8, 793, weren't just announcing morning worship. They were announcing the end of one age and the beginning of another. An age when the most dangerous warrior wasn't necessarily the strongest or the bravest, but the one who could read a calendar and count bell tolls. And this was just the beginning. Because if one young Viking could figure out how to weaponize Easter Sunday, imagine what happens when entire kingdoms start applying that same intelligence to every feast day, every saint's celebration, every moment when faith demands Europeans kneel in prayer. The revolution in medieval warfare had begun, and it would reshape the map of Europe before it was finished. By 820 after Christ, something remarkable is happening in Viking longhouses across Scandinavia. Picture walking into one of these great wooden halls, expecting to see the usual scene: warriors drinking mead, women weaving, children playing with wooden swords. Instead, you find something that would have seemed absolutely impossible to an earlier generation. Christian slaves teaching Norse children to decode Latin texts, while their mothers sharpen battle axes on the same table. This is what evolution looks like in real time, folks. The raiders have transformed from opportunistic pirates into what we'd recognize today as sophisticated intelligence officers. And the scale of this transformation is staggering. In Denmark, King Godfred, and this guy is no minor chieftain, we're talking about one of the most powerful rulers in Scandinavia, maintains a staff of 32 captured monks. 32, their sole purpose, calculating optimal raid dates. These aren't just random prisoners doing manual labor. These are human computers, cross-referencing Christian holidays with favorable wind patterns, tide charts, even lunar cycles. The convergence of spiritual vulnerability and navigational opportunity creates windows of devastating effectiveness that no medieval army has ever exploited before. Think about the sophistication here for a moment. Modern military planners use satellite imagery, weather forecasting, and digital communications to coordinate operations. The Vikings are achieving similar results using captured clergymen, astronomical observations, and an intelligence network that spans from Greenland to Constantinople. They're operating at a level of strategic planning that won't be seen again in Europe until the rise of professional armies centuries later. But it's during the 840s that this system reaches its absolute pinnacle under a leader whose name still sends chills down the spine of anyone who knows medieval history. Ragnar Lothbrok. Now, Ragnar is already a legend by this point, but what he accomplishes during Easter Sunday 845 is something that belongs in the annals of military genius. Picture this. While Ragnar's own fleet is striking Paris, his allied forces are simultaneously hitting Nantes, Hamburg, and London, all on the same day, all precisely when the defenders are gathered for resurrection celebrations. This isn't just raiding anymore. This is the world's first synchronized multinational military operation. The logistics alone should have been impossible. Remember, we're talking about the 9th century. No radios, no telegraphs, no way to communicate across hundreds of miles except by messenger. Yet somehow, Ragnar coordinates attacks across 4 different kingdoms on the same sacred day. How does he do it? The answer lies in something that historians are only beginning to fully appreciate: the Viking intelligence network. See, what makes this possible isn't just military planning, it's commercial infrastructure. Viking merchants are already traveling these routes, already maintaining relationships with local contacts, already familiar with regional customs and religious observances. Ragnar doesn't invent a new communication system, he weaponizes an existing one. The psychological impact of these coordinated attacks proves just as devastating as the physical destruction. Christian chroniclers across Europe record something that should terrify any medieval ruler: mass apostasy. Ordinary believers start questioning why their God permits heathens to succeed specifically during sacred observances. If God is all-powerful, why doesn't he protect his faithful when they're most vulnerable? Why do the pagans seem to know exactly when Christians will be defenseless? Some villages begin posting guards during church services, but this half-measure only demonstrates their crisis of faith to watching Viking scouts. You can't simultaneously trust in divine protection and maintain armed guards. The contradiction is obvious to everyone, including the defenders themselves. And the Vikings? They're taking notes. What's really fascinating is how Viking society itself transforms around this holy day calendar. The raiders develop their own counter-festivals, celebrating what they call the Harvest of Christ Gold during autumn raids, targeting Christian harvest celebrations. It's psychological warfare at the highest level. They're not just attacking during Christian holy days, they're celebrating their own victories on the same dates. Christians should be celebrating divine glory. The women's role in this system deserves special attention because it's absolutely crucial and often overlooked. Viking women are managing complex intelligence networks that put medieval kings to shame. Female merchants memorize feast days across dozens of kingdoms while appearing to trade honey and amber. They're walking, talking databases of religious information, and they're doing it under the noses of Christian authorities who have no idea what they're really collecting. Picture a Viking woman at a market in Francia, haggling over the price of furs with a local merchant. She's asking innocent questions. When do you celebrate St. Martin's feast this year? How long does your harvest festival last? Do all the men attend the Easter Vigil? The merchant thinks she's making conversation. She's actually conducting reconnaissance. The most successful Viking crews develop specialized roles that mirror modern military units. You've got navigators who read stars and tides with supernatural accuracy. You've got berserkers who specialize in breaching church doors and overwhelming surprise defenders. And you've got what they call calendar men, intelligence specialists whose job is ensuring perfect timing based on lunar cycles and religious observances. One captured Viking leader, executed in 860, carried a piece of vellum that should be in a museum if it still existed. This document showed 212 Christian feast days marked with optimal attack phases based on lunar cycles. 212. This guy was carrying what amounts to a military targeting manual disguised as a religious calendar. But the real genius of the system lies in its adaptability. As Christian kingdoms start adjusting their defenses, the Vikings adjust their intelligence gathering. When French monasteries begin varying their service times to avoid predictability, Viking scouts start monitoring individual communities to learn their new patterns. When English kings start posting guards during major feasts, the Vikings shift to targeting minor saints' days that receive less attention. It becomes an arms race of faith versus cunning, with each side constantly adapting to the other's countermeasures. The Christians can't abandon their religious observances without abandoning their identity. The Vikings can't abandon their tactical advantage without losing their edge. So both sides keep escalating, keep innovating, keep pushing the boundaries of what medieval warfare can accomplish. The economic impact on Viking society is transformative. Successful Holy Day raids inject massive amounts of wealth into Scandinavian communities, creating a whole new class of Viking entrepreneurs. Young men who would have remained poor farmers are returning as ship owners, crew leaders, even regional kings. The raids don't just change Viking tactics, they remake Viking civilization. By 860, the system has become so sophisticated that Christian defenders know Vikings will appear whenever important religious observations approach. It's not a surprise anymore, it's a grim certainty. Church bells don't just call the faithful to prayer. They announce to everyone within hearing distance that an attack is probably coming. Yet despite knowing the pattern, despite understanding the threat, most Christian communities still can't effectively counter it, because countering it requires choosing between faith and survival, between spiritual duty and practical defense. And that's a choice that most medieval Christians simply cannot make. The Vikings, meanwhile, are preparing for their greatest triumph yet. Because if coordinated attacks on major feast days can terrorize 4 kingdoms simultaneously, imagine what happens when 40,000 warriors descend on the greatest city in Christian Europe during its most sacred celebration. The stage is being set for a siege that will test everything both sides have learned about the intersection of faith, warfare, and timing. The masters of sacred time are about to face their ultimate challenge. The great heathen army that lands in England during 865 represents something unprecedented in medieval warfare. This isn't just another Viking raid scaled up. This is the ultimate evolution of Holy Day warfare, transformed into a military machine that operates like nothing Europe has ever seen before. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and Ubba, this force of 3,000 Vikings functions more like a modern intelligence unit than a traditional medieval army. And when I say 3,000, I want you to understand what that number means in 9th century terms. Most kingdoms can barely field 1,000 warriors for their entire military. The Vikings have assembled a force 3 times larger than most royal armies, and they're using it with surgical precision. The army maintains networks of Christian informants who provide real-time updates on local saints' days and regional celebrations. Think about that for a second. These are English Christians actively working with pagan invaders to help them target other Christians. Why? Because the Vikings have learned something that modern counterinsurgency experts would recognize. You win hearts and minds through economic incentives. Christian informants are paid better by Vikings than they ever were by their own lords. The intelligence network is so comprehensive that the army's movements follow the liturgical calendar with clockwork precision. English defenders develop an almost supernatural ability to predict where Vikings will strike next. Christmas approaching? Check the monasteries near navigable rivers. Easter week? Look for any community that celebrates with outdoor processions. The Feast of St. Edmund? Well, that's practically painting a target on your back. King Alfred of Wessex, and this guy is going to become Alfred the Great for good reason, faces what might be the most impossible strategic dilemma in medieval history. His deeply Christian kingdom must choose between abandoning religious observance or accepting vulnerability during every holy day. Imagine being a medieval king and having to tell your people that praying to God makes them easy targets for pagans. How do you maintain legitimacy when faith itself becomes a liability? Alfred's solution is nothing short of revolutionary. Warrior monks trained to fight without breaking sacred vows. Picture monasteries where brothers spend their mornings copying manuscripts and their afternoons practicing sword work. These men take vows of non-violence against Christians while maintaining the right to defend against pagans. It's theological innovation born from military necessity. But Alfred goes further. He orders the construction of fortified churches with underground tunnels connecting to barracks. During religious services, armed defenders can move through these hidden passages to emerge behind any attackers who breach the main doors. He establishes rotation systems, ensuring some defenders always remain combat-ready during services, creating what amounts to medieval shift work designed around liturgical schedules. The Vikings respond with typical cunning. They start employing Christian turncoats who spread false information about feast dates. Imagine the psychological warfare here. English communities receive word that St. Cuthbert's feast has been moved to next week due to ecclesiastical calendar corrections. Half the community shows up for services on the wrong day, while the other half attends the actual feast, which is when the Vikings attack the divided, confused defenders. It becomes a shadow war of calendars and counter-calendars, with each side trying to manipulate time itself as a weapon. False feast days, invented saints' celebrations, deliberately confused liturgical schedules, information warfare, in an age when information travels at the speed of a horse. The siege of Paris in 885 marks both the absolute pinnacle of holy day warfare and the beginning of its decline. 40,000 Vikings, 40,000, arrive precisely for the Feast of Saint-Germain, expecting the kind of easy plunder that the system has delivered for nearly a century. To put that number in perspective, Paris itself probably has fewer than 20,000 residents. The Vikings have assembled an army twice the size of the city they're attacking, but Count Odo has spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. Remember, by 885, the pattern has been obvious for decades. Odo knows the Vikings will come during the Feast of Saint-Germain. He knows they'll expect minimal resistance, and he's ready. Instead of finding defenseless Christians at prayer, the Vikings discover Frankish defenders who have spent years studying Viking tactics. Odo's men fight from fortified church towers that have been converted into archery platforms. The sacred buildings that Vikings have exploited for so long become death traps, raining arrows on attackers who expected easy victims. The siege drags on through winter, and this is where the mathematics of holy day warfare finally turn against the Vikings. See? The entire system depends on quick strikes and rapid extraction. Vikings excel at hitting vulnerable targets and disappearing before reinforcements arrive. A prolonged siege plays to none of their strengths while amplifying all their weaknesses. 40,000 warriors need enormous amounts of food, especially during winter. They're camped outside the most important city in Francia, which means every neighboring kingdom knows exactly where they are and can send relief forces. Worst of all, they're not achieving the easy plunder that justified the expedition in the first place. The economic model that drives Viking expansion starts breaking down when reliable tactics become predictable failures. Other European kingdoms take notice. If Count Odo can successfully defend Paris using fortified churches and prepared defenders, maybe the Holy Day raid system isn't invincible after all. Maybe there are ways to maintain faith while providing effective defense. The psychological warfare that favored Vikings for so long starts working against them. Word spreads through Christian Europe that the pagans have been stopped at Paris. Not defeated in some glorious battle, but ground down through preparation, perseverance, and defensive innovation. The Vikings themselves start questioning whether their tactical advantage is permanent or whether they've been riding a wave that's finally crashing against the shore. Some Viking leaders begin considering alternatives to holy day raids, trade missions that don't require perfect timing, settlement opportunities that offer long-term wealth instead of short-term plunder. Even, and this is the ultimate irony, mercenary service protecting Christian kingdoms against other Viking raiders. The siege of Paris doesn't end Viking expansion, but it demonstrates something that changes everything. The system can be beaten, not through superior numbers or better weapons, but through adaptation, preparation, and the willingness to evolve defensive strategies as quickly as Vikings have evolved offensive ones. The masters of sacred time have encountered their first systematic failure, and once a military innovation proves fallible, it's only a matter of time before enemies figure out how to exploit that fallibility. The Vikings have taught Christian Europe how to think strategically about the intersection of faith and warfare. Now they're about to discover that their students have become very, very good pupils. The question isn't whether the age of holy day raids will end, it's whether the Vikings can reinvent themselves before their enemies finish learning everything they have to teach. The transformation begins in Normandy, 911 after Christ, with one of history's most delicious ironies. Rollo, the same Viking raider who perfected holy day attacks against Christian targets, kneels before the Archbishop of Rouen to accept Christian baptism. The man who spent decades exploiting Christian vulnerability during sacred moments now swears to protect those same sacred moments against Viking attack. Picture this scene for a moment. Rollo, hands still scarred from gripping battle axes, receiving holy water from the same church he once terrorized. But this isn't just personal conversion, this is strategic transformation on a massive scale. Because Rollo isn't just becoming a Christian, he's becoming a duke. And dukes need to defend territory, not just raid it. Within months, Rollo is employing his intimate knowledge of Viking tactics to design defenses that are absolutely impregnable against holy day raids. He knows exactly when Vikings will attack because he's planned those attacks himself. He understands how raiders think, how they gather intelligence, how they exploit religious scheduling, and now he's using all that knowledge to make sure no Viking raid in Normandy ever succeeds again. The man who mastered sacred time becomes the architect of its defeat. Churches across Normandy adopt what becomes known as the Norman model, fortifications, designed by an ex-Viking specifically to counter Viking attacks during feast days. Underground passages connecting churches to armories, bell towers converted into archer platforms, fake liturgical schedules designed to confuse raiding timetables. Rollo essentially creates a masterclass in anti-Viking defense, taught by someone who wrote the book on Viking offense. But here's where the story gets really fascinating. Other European kingdoms start recruiting their own Viking converts to design similar defenses. Former raiders become the continent's most sought-after military consultants. Christian kings who spent decades being terrorized by Vikings are now paying former Vikings to teach them how to stop current Vikings. Think about the psychological impact on Viking society. The most successful raiders are defecting to the other side, taking all their tactical knowledge with them. Worse, they're prospering as Christians in ways they never could as pagans. Rollo becomes Duke of Normandy, ruling territory larger than most Scandinavian kingdoms. Other converts receive similar rewards: land, titles, wealth, legitimacy. By 950 after Christ, something unprecedented is happening across Scandinavia. The homeland itself is embracing Christianity. But this isn't conquest from outside, this is transformation from within. Driven by Vikings returning home with Christian wives, captured priests who become trusted advisors, and children raised between two faiths. The process is gradual but inexorable. Viking raiders bring home more than just plunder. They bring back ideas, relationships, and alternative ways of understanding the world. When your son's tutor is a captured monk who treats the boy with genuine affection, when your wife is a Christian princess who demonstrates daily that faith and intelligence can coexist, when your most trusted advisors are former priests who prove their loyalty through years of service, well, maybe these Christians aren't the weak, contemptible enemies you thought they were. King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark converts in 960, and his reasoning tells us everything about how the political landscape has shifted. Harald converts partly to prevent Christian kingdoms from claiming holy war justification for counter-invasions. The Vikings have become so successful that they've made themselves targets for the same kind of coordinated religious warfare they once practiced against others. But the conversion creates profound identity crises for aging Vikings who spent decades raiding churches that are now being built in their own hometowns. Some resolve this psychological conflict by becoming history's most zealous Christian converts, financing monastery construction with plunder stolen from other monasteries. The irony is almost too perfect. Viking gold funding Christian architecture, pagan wealth building sacred spaces. Others struggle with the transition. Imagine being a grizzled raider who remembers when striking a monastery during Easter was a guaranteed path to riches. Now watching your grandson serve as an altar boy in a church built with your own raid profits. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. Yet the most fascinating aspect of this transformation is how thoroughly it changes the nature of European warfare. As Scandinavian kingdoms embrace Christianity, they stop providing safe harbors for pagan raiders. Viking expeditions can no longer count on friendly ports for resupply and reinforcement. The logistics that made large-scale raiding possible simply disappear. Meanwhile, Christian Europe has learned everything the Vikings had to teach about strategic timing, intelligence networks, and coordinated military operations. The students have not only caught up with their teachers, they've started improving on the lessons. The final Holy Day raid of historical significance occurs at Stamford Bridge, September 25, 1066. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king and possibly the most experienced warrior of his generation, attacks during the Feast of St. Firmin, expecting the traditional advantages that Holy Day timing has provided for nearly 3 centuries. Instead, he faces Saxon defenders who have internalized 70 years of anti-Viking tactics. These aren't the confused, unprepared Christians that Bjorn Ironside surprised at Lindisfarne back in 793. These are professional soldiers who know exactly when Vikings prefer to attack and have prepared accordingly. The Vikings arrive without armor, confident in their feast day advantage, expecting to face praying monks rather than prepared warriors. What they find instead are English troops who have been waiting for this exact scenario, positioned to exploit Viking overconfidence, just as effectively as Vikings once exploited Christian vulnerability. As Harald Hardrada dies with an arrow through his throat, and what a way to go for the last great Viking king, the age of Holy Day raids dies with him. The tactical innovation that terrorized Europe for 3 centuries becomes just another historical curiosity, remembered in chronicles but no longer relevant to contemporary warfare. Within a single generation, Norse Christians are writing their own chronicles, condemning their ancestors' tactics while secretly celebrating the wealth and kingdoms those tactics created. The secret trick that made Viking expansion possible becomes a cautionary tale about how military innovation, once revealed and understood, inevitably contains the seeds of its own defeat. The Viking Age doesn't end with some climactic battle or dramatic conquest. It ends with former Vikings building churches, Christian kings hiring ex-raiders as military advisors, and Norse converts writing poetry about the triumph of faith over violence. The cross defeats the axe not through superior force, but through superior adaptation. The Holy Day raids that began with Bjorn Ironside counting bell tolls at Lindisfarne conclude with Harald Hardrada bleeding out on English soil, killed by defenders who learned to think like Vikings while remaining Christian. The evolution is complete. The teachers have been surpassed by their students. The innovators have been defeated by their own innovations, and the age of sacred time warfare has given way to something entirely new. The last dragon ship has sailed into history, and the bells that once announced vulnerability now ring out in victory. The secret that changed medieval warfare has finally been countered by an even greater secret: the willingness to learn, adapt, and evolve. Faster than your enemies can teach you new tricks, the Viking Age is over. The age of Christian military supremacy is about to begin.